Nursery rhymes passed down through generations often wear an innocent veneer. The playful rhythm of most of them disguises the mass of history, politics, and human suffering inside them. In reality, such simple songs for children actually originated from some key historical events and cultural tensions. From the savage religious persecutions under Queen Mary I to the 19th century cycles of poverty in England, these rhymes offer a backward glance through secret windows. Tales behind Mary, Mary, quite contrary, Pop Goes the Weasel, Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush, Rockabye Baby, and London Bridge is Falling Down will help explain just how folklore shows man's difficulties, real fears, and times of societal upheaval. Jack and Jill. It is one of the most recognizable nursery rhymes in the English-speaking world. Its innocuous couplet frequently recited to very young children without any consideration of its origins. But beneath the light-hearted words of a boy and girl fetching water may lie a darker and more complex history, possibly aligned with political intrigue, personal tragedy, and even the fall of a French monarchy. The traditional verse reads, "Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after." The rhyme continues in less well-known verses to describe Jack's recovery and further consequences of their giant tumble. It is, however, this first verse that has captured imaginations and led to a ream of theories about its actual meaning. Theory 1. The fall of the French monarchy. One of the more popular interpretations of the rhyme aligns it with the fate of King Louis XVI of France and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette. In this particular reading, Jack symbolizes Louis XVI, while Jill symbolizes Marie Antoinette. Both of these people were executed during the French Revolution. Whereas Jack falling down might refer to the literal deposing of the king and his subsequent execution in 1793, Jill's tumble could be seen as parallel to Marie Antoinette's execution later that same year. Louis XVI's fall was the consequence of a decade of political missteps, financial crises, and growing civil turmoil. By the end of the decade of the 1780s, the French monarchy had lost much of its authority, and the French people were growing increasingly radicalized under the impetus of poverty and hunger. As soon as the revolution actually broke out in 1789, it became clear that the royal family would not emerge unscathed. In 1791, when Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette tried to flee France, they were intercepted, taken into custody, and put under house arrest. They had already been stripped of their powers, and the revolutionary government was closing in on them. By 1793, the monarchy had been abolished, and both Louis and Marie had been tried and sentenced to death by guillotine. The rhyme's "broke his crown" is typically interpreted as meaning Louis being taken from the throne and directly leading into his decapitation, while Marie's "tumbling after" is representative of her coming demise shortly after her husband's execution. While this analysis has its beauty in terms of historic symmetry, there are problems with its chronology. The earliest surviving publication of the rhyme was in the 1760s, something like 2 to 3 decades before any of the events normally associated with the French Revolution. This suggests that the origins of the rhyme actually could be even before the fall of the French monarchy, and sends scholars looking for other possible origins. Theory 2. English taxation scandal. Another popularly accepted theory then links Jack and Jill with an English taxation scandal of the 17th century. This analysis traces the rhyme to the times of Charles I and ties directly to the monarch's attempts to levy taxes on alcohol, which featured liquid measures such as pints and gills. This theory postulates that Jack and Jill were not individuals at all, but measures. In 1625, Charles V attempted to perform certain reforms on the system of measure and weight, in such a manner that part of his reforms increased revenues on tax, particularly alcoholic beverages like ale and beer, essentials of daily life. The rhyme perhaps refers to an act in which Charles I reduced the volume of the jack. The smaller measure, and thereby the gill, followed suit. This tax manipulation was making people receive less ale for their money, a condition quite unpopular. Jack fell down is indicating the fall of the jack measure, and Jill came tumbling after reflects the reduction in gill further down. While this explanation lacks the drama of an execution by royal decree, it does offer one reasonable explanation for the rhyme within that time frame. It also fits with the rhyme's use of common objects and measurements, something that would appeal to the working classes who suffered as a result of these tax rises. Theory 3. A village scandal. There is yet another, more localized theory rooted in the history of the small village of Kilmersdon in Somerset, England. Jack and Jill, according to local law, refers to a 17th century illicit affair between two young sweethearts from the village. In this tale, Jack was a young man who had become romantically involved with one Jill. The two would often run off up a local hill where they could conduct their clandestine trysts without molestation. One day, while enjoying one of these surreptitious meetings, Jack fell and killed himself. Not much later, Jill discovered she was pregnant and facing the shame and hardship of an out-of-wedlock pregnancy in a profoundly conservative society, died in childbirth. In this sad story, the fall of Jack is but a metaphor for the fall of reputation and future, while Jill tumbles after into her own demise. While this version of events is only very partially supported through documented evidence, the village of Kilmersdon has embraced this tale in the form of local folklore, even going so far as to name the hill after the nursery rhyme. Visitors to the village can still see today the place that supposedly inspired the events in question, and this explanation is therefore one of the most emotionally evocative interpretations. Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. Few experiences are quite as universally lived in childhood as the Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo rhyme for playground choices. The rhyme is catchy, short, and has a nice ring to it. Instantly, it was a hit with children when choosing between items. But while today's version of it seems innocuous, the history that undergirds this rhyme is deeply bothersome. Tracing its evolution means telling a story of racism, cultural shifts, and the really uncomfortable legacy of language. The version of the rhyme as it is more commonly known today reads as, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, catch a tiger by the toe, if he hollers, let him go, Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. This version seems playful, even nonsensical. One imagines the action of catching a tiger by the toe, then letting it go. Whimsy that makes the rhyme suitable for a child. Whimsy that was not part of its original connotation. Earlier versions of this rhyme did contain a racial slur that utterly changed the meaning of it. The earliest written records of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo are centuries old. Since then, variants have cropped up in several cultures and languages worldwide, indicating an oral tradition that is very, very long. In fact, the rhyme of counting itself appears to be rooted in ancient European counting out rhymes. Variants exist in languages from Dutch and Welsh, and it's crystal clear that the basic structure of the rhyme predates its English iteration. But the English version is the one that can boast of really carrying along the darkest baggage, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The line, catch a tiger by the toe, was originally not about a tiger at all. It's a jarring reminder of the casual racism embedded in popular culture at that time. In its original form, the rhyme was racist and perpetuated racial stereotypes, serving as a prime example of how language can reflect and reinforce biases in society. During the 19th century, both the United States and the United Kingdom were trying to come to grips with the remnants of slavery, colonialism, and racial segregation. In such an environment, pejorative language toward black people was not only acceptable, but was socially adopted in most circles. The original rhyme reflected that atmosphere, became part of popular folklore, and thus served to reinforce these racial attitudes. For most of those children in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the nursery rhyme had been passed down for years with little thought given to the rhyme's implications. But as times began to change, specifically in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s, with the onset of the civil rights movement, such words came under examination. This modern version of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, substituting in the word tiger instead of the racial slur, had evolved as a conscious effort to purge the rhyme of its overtly racist roots. This most probably began in the mid-20th century, when awareness of racial equality and sensitivity against offensive language began to take a more serious course in both Britain and America. The adaptation of the rhyme was part of a wider cultural movement that sought to remove offensive or derogatory terminology from public space, especially in the education and entertainment of children. Yet even with changes to the rhyme, its racist history did not entirely get erased from memory. Many people from the older generation remember learning the original version, and there are usages of the slur version deep into the 20th century, even into children's media, that are documented. The uncomfortable legacy of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo reminds one of how pervasive racism was in everyday language and how long it takes to expunge such legacies from common usage. Today's children are unlikely to hear the racist version of the rhyme, but the fact that it survived for so long speaks volumes about the intransigence of racial slurs in society. The evolution of this rhyme speaks to a wider trend in folklore and language. So many of our well-known sayings and nursery rhymes, not to mention songs, carry in heavy doses the weight of historical context which, if judged from the modern point of view, could be very troublesome or offensive. While societies evolve and the language changes, their respective changes reflect some of the changed values within them, but what has been left behind often remains hidden beneath the surface of even the most innocently sounding phrases. Although most parents and teachers these days are likely unaware of its former meaning, the rhyme's past is not entirely forgotten. Whenever reports arise of the original version of the rhyme surfacing, they have sparked public outrage, particularly in media venues. In 2004, a flight attendant sparked angry backlash when employing the rhyme while trying to seat passengers. The airline apologized, deeming the original version of the rhyme to have racist overtones. These incidents illustrate how impossible it is to excise injurious language entirely from a cultural memory. Sometimes, even when the slurs have been taken out, the historical context may suddenly spike again without warning, reminding society that it needs to be ever vigilant about the ghosts of racism laced into linguistic and folkloric symbolism. Ring around the Rosie. Beneath its playful, seemingly harmless tone is the grim tale of one of the most awful pandemics to afflict humanity, more colloquially referred to as the Black Death. The connection between the rhyme and the plague is a widely debated topic. However, while some historians do try to urge caution against taking an overly literal approach to this association, the interpretation popularly drawn nonetheless bears intrigue and could be further delved into with great interest. The best-known form of the rhyme is as follows: ring around the Rosie, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. At face value, the words are uncomplicated, almost ridiculous, but scholars and non-scholars alike have discerned a possible meaning behind each line that matches very closely with symptoms and reactions to the Black Death that swept across Europe in the 14th century. Some say the rhyme is a metaphorical expression of the pain, death, and attempts at protection during the plague. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, started to surge across Europe in 1347 and continued for 4 years, ultimately killing an estimated 1/3 of the European population. It moved rapidly along trade routes, especially by fleas on rats on merchant ships. Cities and towns descended into chaos as the symptoms of the disease became visibly horrific and sure to prove fatal. Painful swellings called buboes formed in the victim's lymph nodes of the groin, armpits and neck, accompanied by fever, chills, vomiting and black spots on the skin that appeared as a result of internal bleeding. Victims often died within days. It is within this context that many believe Ring Around the Rosie reflects. The association begins with the first line, ring around the Rosie. The phrase ring around the Rosie is generally understood to mean a red ring in the form of a rash, which was part of the beginning stages of symptoms associated with the bubonic plague. During later stages of the disease, such rings of inflammation typically formed around sores or buboes, their presence an assured infection. The word rosy can mean the color of such sores pinkish or red when the infection had taken its hold in the body. That explanation also agrees with the medical descriptions of the Black Death's early symptoms, making the rhyme decidedly darker in tone when placed into a historical perspective. This interpretation, however, is debated. Some folklorists argue that the actual dates of its origin are far later than the Black Death, even in the 17th century or even the 19th, and point to the fact that similar rhymes existed in various European cultures, which may have nothing to do with the plague at all. Yet, the idea of a rash with Rosie remains one of the most compelling links to the medieval pandemic. Perhaps the second line, most obviously related to the practices during plague, is a pocket full of posies. With such desperation to find ways to protect themselves against this disease, many people turned to folk remedies based on the belief that the air itself was poisoned. The miasma theory held that the vehicle of disease was foul air, and in that era it was quite common to carry herbs, flowers, and spices upon one's person, with the hopes of warding off deadly bad air with sweet scents. This includes taking herbs and stuffing them in their pockets or worn in pouches around their necks, thus managing to create a barrier for protection. Doctors treating plague victims also sport similarly aromatic-filled beaked masks to filter out the supposed contaminants in the air. This is rather a grim reflection of the practice at best. The mention of the rhyme with the posies, therefore, constitutes a direct reference to the futile attempts which people made to protect themselves from an invisible killer. No amount of herbal remedies could actually manage or prevent the spread of the plague, but the practice did indeed continue throughout the pandemic, as people clung to anything that might offer some semblance of control in a world seemingly falling apart. The third line of the rhyme, ashes, ashes, has many times been thought to reflect upon the prevalence of death and subsequent destruction that the Black Death brought upon the world. Other historians think that it speaks of the burning of bodies since there were too many to bury, and mass graves got filled pretty fast. Cities were finding it hard to get rid of the large number of corpses at their disposal. Another reading is the ashes, as a reference to the stages of the actual disease. As gangrene set in, parts of the body would blacken, seeming almost as though they had been burnt. The word ashes in this case perhaps speaks more concretely to the physical decay brought on by the plague, the reduction of healthy bodies to the remains of a fire, so to speak. This line has also been related to a ritual chant that goes on in places of worship, where the ashes symbolize the return to dust, which is inevitable after the death of a person. With the spread of the plague turning uncontrollable, religious processions and prayers were held up front, seeking divine help to resolve the problem. Ashes bring to mind a transient life, especially when one talks of such a time when death was everywhere, seen by everybody. The last line of the rhyme completes the dark cycle, we all fall down. It is generally taken that it refers to the death that nearly everyone who contracted the plague faced. Mortality rates were scarily high, where whole families, villages and cities were wiped out. Because death was a foregone conclusion, this last line captures the sense of fatalism that had to permeate society through the observation of loved ones, and ultimately, oneself falling to the disease. Although there are some versions of the rhyme that end with the falling down of the players playing the game, which is a simulation of the fall brought about by death. The light-heartedness of such an act in modern interpretations obscures the tragedy that it is said to portray. Humpty Dumpty. Sometimes equated solely with a fragile egg, but its origins lie far from the nursery. The history of the character, to a great extent forgotten today, tells not the story of some simple egg-shaped figure, but that of a strong weapon used during one of the most turbulent periods in English history, known as the English Civil War. As the rhyme goes today, it's deceptively simple. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. These lines have been recited for generations, building a picture in the minds of the people, an egg sitting precariously on a wall, falling and then breaking into pieces with no possibility of repair. That meaning has been nailed into the public imagination, thanks in great part to illustrations from 19th century books, particularly Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where Humpty Dumpty was famously depicted as an egg. But the rhyme's historical roots are suggestive of a far more complex and violent past. One of the most plausible theories places Humpty Dumpty within the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651, which was a violent and disastrous war between the Royalists, who stood with King Charles I, and the parliamentarians who wanted greater control over the monarchy. One of the most important battles in this war happened during the Siege of Colchester, the main Royalist base, back in 1648. At this time, Colchester was being besieged by the parliamentarian forces, determined to take the town from the Royalist defenders. The town's fortifications were heavily armed, and among the weapons mounted on its walls was a large cannon affectionately nicknamed Humpty Dumpty. Cannons during this period were crucial to any form of defense or offense. Large artillery pieces were often stationed on the wall to bombard an approaching enemy or to hold off an advancing army. In sieges, such cannons were considered vital, and no different was Humpty Dumpty. This cannon was mounted on the southern wall of the town and gave great advantage to the Royalists in the defence of Colchester. In this long siege, however, the defences of the town were subjected to relentless bombardment by the parliamentarian forces. Ultimately, the wall on which Humpty Dumpty was sitting was badly damaged. The cannon, sitting atop this crumbling fortification, tumbled to the ground, a great fall in the most literal sense. Being on the ground, the cannon was too heavy and cumbersome, hence all attempts at raising it back onto the wall were unsuccessful. All the king's horses and king's men were unable to restore Humpty Dumpty to its power. Without the cannon to defend the town, the failure of the Royalist forces to fend off the siege of the parliamentarians was thus weakened, and so Colchester fell. Indeed, it was one of the pivotal moments in the fall of one of the last Royalist strongholds that helped bring about the eventual defeat of King Charles I, who would be executed in 1649. The siege of Colchester and the function of artillery within the conflict bring a much more substantial understanding of this rhyme than does this simplistic image of a broken egg. During the 17th century, cannons were a symbol of military might, and their presence often decided the fate of a battle. Cannons, such as Humpty Dumpty, were enormous, and when mounted upon a wall, they were powerful deterrents against any approaching enemy. Yet these arms were fragile in their own particular way too. For one thing, if dislodged or shattered, their great weight and size made them almost impossible to reset, especially in the heat of war. The story of Humpty Dumpty, the cannon, is indicative also of the wider story of the English Civil War itself. The conflict saw shifting allegiances, the smashing of once joined mighty institutions, and the loss of conventional power structures. Just as the fall of Humpty Dumpty marked the end of Colchester's defence, so the beheading of Charles I was the end of the English monarchy as England had known it. The war finally established the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell, in which England was for some time a non-monarchy. Thus, poor Humpty Dumpty's transformation from a powerful war cannon into a fragile egg is only one example of how folklore evolves over time, often shedding its more violent or political origins for versions more suitable for children. By the 19th century, the original historical context of the rhyme had largely been forgotten. Illustrators and authors, such as Lewis Carroll, helped seal Humpty Dumpty's fate as the egg of the poem. Carroll's Through the Looking Glass contains that most famous of exchanges between Alice and a smug, anthropomorphic egg Humpty Dumpty perched on a wall. The image was so striking that it stamped out once and for all the lingering connection with the English Civil War. The transformation of the rhyme into a children's story speaks to the resiliency of oral traditions, where over time stories are adapted to meet interests and sensibilities of those who listen. What started out as a war story about destruction and defeat became a moral lesson in the inconstant nature of life, or, in its simplified form, a children's game intended to teach kids to recite. Baa Baa Black Sheep. The origins are far from the very playful chant we hear today. This rhyme, essentially with just a talking sheep and some bags of wool, had their root in the time of existence when wool was not merely a commodity, but the backbone of the English economy. But behind its innocent face, the poem masks the tale of exploitation, heavy taxation, and the adversities faced by the medieval farmers during the time of King Edward I. The commonly known version of the rhyme goes, "Baa Baa Black Sheep, have you any wool? Yes sir, 3 bags full, 1 for the master, 1 for the dame, and 1 for the little boy who lives down the lane." On the surface, it sounds like a benign tale of a sheep divvying up its wool. But the historical context behind those words offers a much more complex and sometimes disturbing image of what life was really like in 13th century England. The rhyme has its roots, in fact, in the time of King Edward I of England, who ruled from 1272 to 1307. King Edward I was notable for many things: his wars with Scotland, his legislation, and his monumental building. But one of the less well-remembered aspects of his reign was a quite heavy tax on wool. At the beginning of the 13th century, Wool was England's most vital export item. The country was very dependent on the wool trade, and no finer English wools existed in Europe. Wool was traded, above all, with Flanders, what is now Belgium, where it was woven into textiles and sold again across the continent. This trade was important not only to the nobility of England, but also to the common farmers who raised the sheep, as often the wool was worth far more than the land itself. With such importance of wool, Edward I found an avenue to increase the income of the royalty. In 1275, he instituted a wool tax called the Great Custom. It imposed on the wool producers to pay to the crown a fixed amount per sack of wool, which they could sell, and thus lay a burden on the farmers who produced it and the merchants who traded in it. It was to be apportioned in three: 1/3 to the king, hence master, 1/3 to the church or local nobility, or in other words, dame, and the remaining portion to the farmer or worker, the little boy who lives down the lane. Thus, it represents directly the style of the rhyme. The wool growers in England felt the pinch of the tax imposed by Edward I. To the sheep farmers, who were small landowners or peasants, wool was a valuable commodity. The sheep were, nevertheless, sources of meat, milk, and other byproducts. The introduction of the wool tax cut down their profit enormously. Under those circumstances, to continue their livelihood was much harder. The 3 bags full in this rhyme likely symbolized the apportioning of the wealth between the classes. The king, the nobility, and the church all took their share, leaving the common people, the little boy, little or nothing. This burden was being felt rather acutely by smaller landowners and shepherds, who, although having less wool to sell, continued to pay disproportionate amounts of their earnings to the crown and the church. Black may also denote the colour of the sheep. Black wool was conventionally considered much less valuable than white wool, since it could not be dyed as easily. In such context, the black sheep may be the symbol for the less fortunate, those whose wool, and therefore income, was of lesser value. It is further possible that the black sheep represents the underdog, the common farmer or labourer who was burdened by taxes that primarily benefited the ruling class. The wool tax had far-reaching effects on the economy of England. As Edward I continued to raise the tax rate to pay for his wars and building initiatives, resentment grew among the population. The tax mostly fell on the poor in the countryside since they had no other means of protesting. These are the kinds of economic stresses that contributed to broader social tensions during the period. Peasants and small landowners were struggling to survive under the weight of increased taxation. While there is nothing to suggest categorically that Baa Baa Black Sheep was constructed as a protest, by no stretch of the imagination is it unfair to consider that the rhyme displays a feeling of helplessness or frustration that must have driven those being exploited to utilize the wool tax. It is a thinly veiled commentary on the imbalance of the era, in which most of the money is taken by the ruling elite and little is left for the commoners to subsist on. Rock-a-bye baby. One of the most common lullabies that have always been sung to babies over the centuries, but in reality, it might actually derive from one of the most politically sensitive periods in English history. Far from being an innocent baby lullaby, this rhyme is imagined to reflect the high tide of religious and political tension in 17th century England, especially in regard to the birth of the Catholic heir to King James II. This era, marked by sharp Protestant Catholic divides, contextualized the lullaby as a quiet expression of Protestant wishes that the Catholic royal line would not persist. The rhyme, in its most commonly recognized form, is "Rock-a-bye baby, on the treetop, when the wind blows the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all." Above all, the lullaby upon first glance does indeed appear quiet and serene, with one or two foreboding overtones, a baby being rocked in his cradle. On the other hand, it carries a much darker meaning upon considering another perspective, as it pertains to 17th century English politics. The rock-a-bye baby lyric requires some historical and religious background before its meaning can be understood. England by the late 1600s was a very divided country. The English Civil War and the execution of King Charles I in 1649 were followed in 1660 by the restoration of the monarchy with the accession of his son, Charles II, to the throne. The monarchy had been restored, but religious feeling was still running very high, particularly between Catholics and Protestants. These tensions finally came to a head during the reign of King James II, 1685 to 1688, whereas his brother, Charles II, was perspicacious enough to keep his own Catholicism beneath the radar of public scrutiny. James was an avowed and fervent Catholic, his rise to the throne thus causing great alarm among the predominantly Protestant population of the realm. To many English Protestants, the spectre of a Catholic monarchy had always been a haunting one. When James married the Catholic Mary of Modena, and they eventually came to expect an heir, the stakes were raised ever higher. This possibility of a Catholic dynasty actually setting a tight hold on the English throne sent Protestants into an uproar, who wished no male offspring born or surviving. The Protestant ruling class favoured James's Protestant daughter Mary from his first marriage, married to William of Orange, a Protestant leader from the Netherlands. In event, their hope was that when James died, the crown would pass to Mary, maintaining Protestant rule in England. Above, it was mentioned that in 1688 political anxiety reached its peak when James II's Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son named James Francis Edward Stuart. He was called the Old Pretender. His birth was momentous, however, because it threatened the possibility of a Catholic succession. Hitherto, many Protestants had felt comforted by the fact that James's daughters, Mary and Anne, were both Protestant and, therefore, his likely successors. Now, with the arrival of a Catholic male heir, so this hope was dashed. It soon gained currency on the Protestant population that this was not James and Mary's child after all, but a changeling, brought into the birthing room, smuggled in a warming pan, to make sure there was at least a Catholic successor. Needless to say, this accusation could not be sustained on the strength of any evidence, but the mere rumour also speaks to how great a degree of distrust and paranoia shrouded the Catholic monarch. It was in this climate of uncertainty that Rockabye Baby emerged as the expression of Protestant hopes for the downfall of the Catholic heir. The cradle rocking in the treetop is a symbol of the precarious position of the newborn prince, literally suspended high above a world where his future reign was far from assured. When the wind blows refers to the mighty political forces, especially Protestant opposition, which wanted to bring down the Catholic monarchy. The bough breaking and the baby's fall symbolized the desired collapse of the Catholic line, with the hope that the infant would not survive to rule. It was not limited to whispers or lullabies in protest against the succession of a Catholic heir to King James II. It came to a head in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which had James II removed in a bloodless coup. A group of Protestant nobles invited William of Orange, James's son-in-law, and a staunch Protestant to invade England and assume the throne alongside his wife, Mary. James II fled to France, and William and Mary were declared joint monarchs of England. This development effectively ensured the Protestant rule. The baby prince, James Francis Edward Stuart, was exiled and never ascended to the throne. Although there would be future Jacobites, that is to say, the line of Stuart claimants, who continued, with the periodic rising, to assail the British throne for decades to come, the Protestant establishment endured. The rhyme can therefore be interpreted as a prophetic metaphor for the upheaval in politics. The fall of the baby and the broken bough symbolize the fall of the Catholic Stuart line and the triumph of Protestantism. William and Mary thus ensured Protestant rule in England, and over the years the lullaby survived while its origins were forgotten by the people. Pop Goes the Weasel. A nursery rhyme and a popular children's song, but beneath its airy melodic cloak lies a rather grim tale of economic hardship in 19th century England. At its core, the rhyme is about poverty, survival, and the practice of pawning everyday possessions to make ends meet. The phrase, "Pop Goes the Weasel," is actually a reference to pawning or popping a coat, generally the most valuable garment one owned, for money. In that respect, what at first seemed to be a nonsense rhyme actually reflects one of the cruel facts of working-class life in Victorian England. The traditional rhyme, as sung, goes, "All around the mulberry bush the monkey chased the weasel. The monkey thought 'twas all in fun, pop goes the weasel. A penny for a spool of thread, a penny for a needle, that's the way the money goes, pop goes the weasel." This rhyme, upon first glance, seems to be an innocuous, light-hearted children's song, but its lyrics heavily interweave with the socio-economic atmosphere of the age. Through the 19th century, England was generally going through rapid industrialization. Associated with this process was the concomitant expansion in the gap between the rich and the poor. Life for the working class individual came hand in hand with financial instability, such that the working class did not earn much, and therefore had to struggle when purchasing some of the basic needs that they required. The only way many survived was by pawning whatever belonged to them. The word pop in the rhyme refers to pawning an item, which was a regular way for the working poor. Pawnbrokers lend money for a short term on the value of possessions they take. Later, clients can redeem the pawned possessions by paying back the loan with interest. If failing to pay the loan, the item is lost and sold by the pawnbroker. Clothing, tools, and household items were regularly pawned. In the nursery rhyme, the weasel probably referred to a winter coat, an exceedingly prized and necessary possession that was placed inside only as an ultimatum to get enough to fund everyday needs. The pawning of the coat was not only an economic transaction, it became synonymous with the desperation and vulnerability of the working class. The cyclical nature of this rhyme popping the weasel, the money going, speaks to the near impossibility of escaping poverty, as families found themselves repeatedly pawning their meager possessions simply to survive. The phrase weasel in this rhyme denotes a coat made of good fabric, very often a winter overcoat. Another thought on this expression is that the word weasel might be an abbreviation for weasel and stoat, which was a perfect rhyme for coat in Cockney rhyming slang. The coats were really valuable not only because they were highly expensive to buy, but also because they essentially helped people live through the harsh winters. Such a coat was not a small thing to decide either to give up or pawn in a world that exposed their inhabitants to the cold so starkly. In most instances, the immediate need for cash took precedence over long-term discomfort. The Victorian era was an age of sharp contrasts, social and economic. The Industrial Revolution opened the way to technological changes and the growth of economy. On the other hand, it promoted emergent class of permanent semi-famished. Workers employed in factories, mines and textile mills gained barely enough to pay their rent and buy food, not to mention any extra expenses. Pawning possessions during hard times became a lifesaver for those who had to survive from one paycheck to another. The second stanza of the rhyme reads, "A penny for a spool of thread, a penny for a needle." All the money anyone had to spend was just that little. Even the most mundane household items needed to be intricately budgeted for, such as sewing. In a certain way, repetition of the line, "That's the way the money goes," portrays how strongly and constantly this small sum of money, that is all the money working-class families can muster, has a way of only going out, having a life full of cycles regarding their financial problems. Every penny was accounted for, and any unexpected expenses would put a family into an ever-downward spiral of pawnbrokers and transient handouts. "Pop Goes the Weasel" can be considered a subtle form of social commentary because the song is able to offer a peek into the precarious lives of poor working people. It is also indicative of the rise in Victorian England of pawn shops. The pawnbroker was an integral part of the economy, particularly in such areas as urban centres, where workers more often than not found themselves with short pockets before payday. The mulberry bush of the nursery rhyme and the picture painted by the monkey chasing a weasel give almost a playful nature to the song and show a characteristic that children can understand. But beneath that surface, the rhyme seamlessly captures anxiety and hardship in life in the lower classes for those who are caught by misfortune. Thus, the monkey of debt or hardship continually chases the weasel around until the inevitable moment when the weasel must be pawned to make ends meet. Here we go round the mulberry bush. Perhaps one of the staple nursery rhymes known to most, with children singing its familiar lines while circling hand in hand. Yet behind its simple lyrics, some scholars believe it is tied to a much more somber historical context, the lives of female prisoners at Wakefield Prison in 19th century England. It is this relationship that gives the rhyme quite a dark and complex meaning, based on experiences of women navigating through punitive and oppressive systems of the time. The familiar lines of this rhyme read as follows: "Here we go, round the mulberry bush, the mulberry bush, the mulberry bush. Here we go round the mulberry bush, on a cold and frosty morning." It is typically performed by children who run in circles performing actions like they are washing, scrubbing and dressing. Choruses, seemingly light-hearted depictions of domestic chores may have a stronger provenance and serve as a more meaningful connection to leading figures in prison with mundane daily routines. Wakefield Prison is one of the oldest prisons functioning today, originally constructed in 1594 within West Yorkshire, England. It constituted one of the primary female correctional facilities of the 19th century. Through this period, there were strict routines in the penal systems, and exercise was one of the few activities that were officially permitted to relieve the prison inactivity. Various prison reform movements had prompted better care for the inmates, but life was nonetheless relentless and repetitive for the female prisoners. The mulberry bush in the rhyme refers to a very real tree said to have been in the yard of the prison. Some historians believe the female prisoners were made to circumambulate the mulberry tree when they came out for exercise. These circular walks that the prisoners had to undertake daily became routine in their closely controlled and repetitive lifestyle, with each day passing like any other. This routine would have been one of the very few moments when they experienced movement or freedom in an otherwise rigidly controlled environment. The phrase "cold and frosty morning" might recall the chill of early morning exercises that were part of hard discipline imposed commonly on prisoners. The physical conditions of incarceration in Victorian England were harsh. During winter, prisoners often had to put up with poor heating and lack of proper clothes. Undoubtedly, a harsh environment together with compulsory exercise turns these morning walks into a remarkable and bleak moment in everyday life. The association of the nursery rhyme with routine reflects the wider penal practices of the time. Thus, during the Victorian era, there was a move toward the employment of discipline and labour as corrective mechanisms. Women prisoners were made to carry out repetitive work as part of their punishment and rehabilitation in jail. Such tasks were often mundane jobs of laundry, sewing, and other household chores that would supposedly lead to discipline and moral rectification. These actions described in the rhyme washing, scrubbing, and dressing parallel those types of tasks female prisoners would have been expected to perform. In that respect, the rhyme can be seen to reflect both the gendered expectations foisted on women in the 19th century and the effort of the prison system to reinforce those roles even within the confines of incarceration. Women were expected to learn something good and useful, even while inside, through domestic work. This was a system of discipline that was not confined to punishment, but rather one that sought to reform women within the accepted parameters of society at the time. The repetitive, almost ritualistic nature of the set of tasks that they had to engage in became not only punishment in itself, but a means to break their spirit and mold their behavior. The endless cycles of exercise, chores, and punishment formed the rhythm of prison life as the cyclical motion of walking round the mulberry bush. As enticing a history as this is, it's interesting to set the prison rhyme theory in perspective within a larger frame of penal reform during the 19th century. The Victorian era was an age of great change in the running of prisons. Reforms aimed at taking the emphasis off punishment and onto rehabilitation. But in practice, these efforts frequently manifested themselves as repressive regimes, dependent on hard discipline, isolation, and repetitive labour. Early prison reformers such as Elizabeth Fry fought for the rights of women prisoners, arguing women needed teaching and spiritual guidance, not just punishment. Yet, all this reflected a reform movement, and prison life was harsh. For women in particular, confinement implied moral suspicion and correction. This supposed association of "here we go round the mulberry bush" with the workout regimes in Wakefield Prison puts it within the age of prison reform. It also serves to illustrate the Victorian spectrum of views regarding crime, punishment, and gender roles. The prison structure was less a place of retribution than one of reformation. The aim was not just to punish, but to make women submissive, acceptable members of society, often through the means of domestic work and religious education. Whether the tree was symbolic of the real was secondary, as the mulberry tree became an anchor to the circular, repetitive life of the prisoners. In a very real sense, the women moved in circles around the tree day after day, trapped behind the endless circle of prison life. Time that had apparently come to a standstill. For those who paced back and forth in the prison yard, perhaps the mulberry bush represented the boundary of their little small world. Freedom lay outside of that circle. This theory also reflects on the power of symbols that underlie everyday life. What could have been a most ordinary tree became a focus of the routines and confinements of the women of Wakefield. The eternal circling mirrored the lack of progress in their lives, a situation in which days blended into each other and little hope of change. London Bridge is falling down. This light, airy refrain has been sung by generations of children everywhere, but the tale behind this nursery rhyme is anything but light and airy. While today's version perhaps conjures up visions of a crumbling bridge, the true origins of this song are layered with history, myth, and folklore. Some say it refers either to the attack by Viking invaders or to the natural deterioration of London's famous bridge. Both theories offer a fascinating glimpse into a past where the legends of its destruction and construction have left their mark on one of the most famous landmarks of England. The modern lyrics of London Bridge is falling down are familiar to most of us. London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady. Children often recite this rhyme and play a game of going through arches made by their friends, who are supposed to act symbolically as the bridge. This song may appear simple, but all the possible significations from it are much more complex and historically rich. The mention of falling down is evocative of times when London Bridge, the oldest known crossing over the River Thames, was prone to destruction and decay. In fact, one of the most interesting theories which join the rhyme to an event in the early 11th century is during a Viking invasion. It centers on the Norwegian king Olaf II, also called Saint Olaf, who allied with the English against the Danish invaders occupying London. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a series of annals that describe events during that time, mentions that Olaf was indeed a participant in a shared attack on the London Bridge, dating back to 1014. According to the story, Olaf's forces attached ropes to the timber supports of the bridge and rowed their longboats back down the Thames, pulling the bridge into the river. With London Bridge out of the way, Olaf's fleet could advance, leading to the eventual recapture of the city. The fall of London Bridge was a critical turning point in the fight for control over London. This legend has been argued over by historians, but it still remains an intriguing theory embedded in English and Norse folklore. The Icelandic saga Olaf's Saga Helga from the 13th century relates a very similar version to the bridge destruction, and in that respect there is some validity to the suggestion that Olaf's daring raid left such an imprint on English minds that it was immortalized in song. If this rhyme indeed refers to that raid, then it will be one of the very few examples where a real historical incident survived, in a gap of many hundreds of years, in oral tradition, integrated into a game played by children long after any recollection of the particular conflict had disappeared from public memory. A far more banal and plausible interpretation of its origins, however, is that it describes the gradual collapse of London Bridge, which suffered at the hands of old age and was also shoddily built. The history of the bridge extends nearly 2,000 years, with several versions of the structure being built and rebuilt over the centuries. The first bridge to span the Thames, built by the Romans, dates back to the 1st century AD. By the time this rhyme is said to have originated, however, London Bridge was into one of its many reincarnations. The medieval version of London Bridge, completed in 1209, was a grand stone structure with 19 arches and a number of buildings, including shops and houses upon it. Over time, the weight finally caught up with the bridge, alongside the wear and tear of nature. Parts started falling off at different times throughout its life, calling for innumerable repairs and reconstructions. The bridge was known to be always under repair, until it became apparent during the 19th century that the medieval bridge could no longer serve the ever-expanding city. Eventually, this structure was demolished and a new bridge was built in its place, 1831. The idea that London Bridge is falling down might be a metaphor for this eternal process of deterioration and renewal is not entirely impossible. During its long lifetime, the bridge was perpetually falling down, either because of the strain of the buildings sitting atop it, ice flows, fires, or simply with the passing of time. This perpetual process of collapse and renewal may be mirrored in the rhyme. One of the oldest and most steady legends related to London Bridge is falling down asserts that human sacrifice somehow factored into the construction process of the bridge. It is, after all, a familiar medieval superstition. In order to stabilize large constructions of bridges and buildings, sacrifices needed to be made of a human life. The spirit of the sacrificed person would guard the place from collapsing. There is some related theory to this, connected with a mention of My Fair Lady in the rhyme, interpreted as a possible reference to the sacrifice of a woman, a queen, or a noblewoman, to get stability for London Bridge. However, there was no such historical proof found, and that theory has been regarded as a legend. And yet the tenacity of the story speaks to how folklore and superstition informed people's perceptions about building design and construction during the medieval era. Mary, Mary, quite contrary. This one of those nursery rhymes that are whimsical and harmless on the surface. The playful language and rhythmic cadence easily make one forget that it most likely refers to one of the darkest and bloodiest periods in English history. The Mary in the rhyme is generally believed to be Queen Mary I, a monarch whose rule was marked by a campaign of religious persecution. Better known as Bloody Mary, her failed attempt to restore Catholicism in England was marked with hundreds of Protestants dying because of her decree. The popular version goes, "Mary, Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow, with silver bells and cockleshells and pretty maids all in a row." On the surface, the rhyme describes a woman tending her garden. Yet many historians insist that the rhyme carries encrypted references to the violence of Queen Mary's rule. Each element relates to some gruesome reality of her reign. Mary then took the throne in 1553 after the brief and mired rule of her half-brother Edward VI. Being the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Mary was a staunch Catholic, for whom Edward's Protestant reforms were nothing less than high treason against the Catholic Church. Once she came into power, Mary was determined to turn back these changes and bring England once again under the papacy. This labelled her as quite contrary in the nursery rhyme, as she had very opposing religious policies compared to the Protestant inclinations of the time. Her first acts of reign were the reinstatement of the Catholic Mass and revisions of Edward and his advisors. These policy changes were merely the tip of the iceberg in her attempt to restore Catholicism. Mary implemented her religious policies through the persecution campaign against Protestants. Therefore, she was termed Bloody Mary. Countless numbers of Protestants were burnt at the stake for heresy between 1555 and 1558, totaling over 280, a grim legacy that would haunt her reputation for centuries. It just so happens that every word in Mary, Mary, quite contrary has been analysed to be some sort of symbolic reference to aspects of Mary's rule, most particularly her horrific enforcement of Catholic doctrine. How does your garden grow? This line is said to allude to Mary's growing list of Protestant martyrs. Here, the garden is a metaphor for the country, its growth symbolic of a growing number of executions carried out upon her command. The burnings of Protestants were not isolated, private events but public spectacles created to instill fear into those opposing her. Sometimes, fumes from the executions filled the air, and the message would be clear across the nation. Defiance would not be accepted. The word garden could have another meaning here, which suggests that it speaks of Mary's barrenness. Throughout her reign, Mary had rather serious problems with her fertility. 2 false, highly public pregnancies she experienced drove English politics into a tumultuous time and caused her so much personal sorrow. For without a Catholic heir, her half-sister Elizabeth would remain next in line to the throne, a fact to which one could attribute the commoners' growing dissatisfaction with Mary. These innocuous-sounding words have been interpreted to represent instruments of torture under Mary's regime. Silver bells could be the tinkle of small bells on the robes of priests while performing Catholic Mass, indicative of restored ritualistic Catholicism in England. The restoring of Catholic ways was the cornerstone of Mary's reign, and she utilised it as a religious as well as a political instrument to perpetuate her powers. Some scholars believe that the silver bells may be thumbscrews. A torture device used to crush prisoners' fingers and cockleshells could refer to another torture method, possibly with shells used in a painful manner. These tortures are not clearly recorded in the rhyme, but the use of such devices shows that the very violent methods Mary employed in enforcement of her Catholic agenda were indeed used. Pretty maids all in a row. This line is often interpreted metaphorically as referring to the executions of Protestant martyrs. so many of whom were women. The pretty maids can be understood to refer to ranks of Protestant women led to their deaths, publicly forced to die for refusing to renounce their faith. Another interpretation actually links the pretty maids to nuns or Catholic convents, which Mary reinstated during her reign as part of her attempt to restore Catholicism. It is also interpreted that pretty maids all in a row might refer to the ladies-in-waiting of Mary, or her women adherents who were loyal to her, even as she was becoming increasingly unpopular. The placing of women in positions of authority within Mary's court stands in dramatic juxtaposition to the mass executions of Protestant women outside the circle of royalty. Conclusion. The nursery rhymes we sing without a second thought are often much more than innocent melodies. They represent the echoes of forgotten struggles, veiled references to political shifts, social inequalities, and moments of human resilience. These stories remind one that even innocent-sounding tunes can have the weight of history attached to them. If it is, as a rhyme connected with the rise and fall of monarchs, or to the daily grind of poverty, then the following may well prove a testament to the memory that culture carries, sometimes in the most unlikely of places. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden truths behind these familiar tunes, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more fascinating dives into the past. And remember, sometimes the most captivating histories are those disguised in the verses we know by heart. Until next time, my dear spooker, stay curious.